Good morning once again. We will start the first plenarium, and I will invite Professor Lan Chui to give the first keynote speech of the conference about policy challenges in implementing sustainable development goals, a view from transitional China. Just 1 second. Thank you very much, Professor Lan Chui, for having accepted our invitation, for being here with us and sharing your speech with us with this conference, the 22nd Annual ISDRS. So it's an enormous pleasure to welcome you here in Lisbon and in the conference. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this wonderful meeting. I'm very pleased to be here to talk about the sustainable development challenge in a view from transitional China. I saw that at the President's presentation about the partners of this society. I'm very pleased to see that SDSN is a partner. I've been involved with SDSN, and so I'm very happy to see that we are great partners here. I think in today's presentation, I will mainly, first of all, talk about what are the policy challenges in implementing SDG, Sustainable Development Goals, and also particularly from a view from institutional China, from transitional China. I think that the theme of this conference really focused on the contextualizing the sustainable development, and I think indeed I think the SDG after its adoption in UN last year, I think now the key challenge is how to implement it, and I think the implementation really starts from every country, from every community. So I think each country, each community is very, very different. So I think that now we have to really start from there, from each country and each community. So I'm presenting here the views from China. First of all, I think we were all extremely happy last year that SDG was adopted in UN in September 2015. In a way, I think this is after a very long, I think, elaborative process in getting from MDG to SDG. I think it all started in 2012 at Rio +20 when I think a mandate was set to implement inclusive and transparent intergovernmental process open to all stakeholders with a view to developing global sustainable development goals to be agreed by the General Assembly. And then I think there's a very elaborative process involving all various member states, UN system, civil society, business, and millions of others in this process. I was very fortunate to be able to be involved with SDSM, and we actually also produced a report as an input to the UN for the final deliberation of the Sustainable Development Goals. And finally, I think in the September 25th to 27th, and 17 SDGs was agreed upon by 193 member states to be adopted by the member states. I think we all agree that actually there are some key features of SDG that made it very different, say, from MDG and other similar efforts. I think, first of all, I think the policy process enriched the concept of sustainable development and set a higher goals for human society. I think that, in fact, I think the three key pillars of the newly adopted sort of, concept of sustainable development involves both involves economic development, social justice, and environmental protection. And also, it's developed through a more like both top-down and bottom-up approach, initiated initially by the UN, but also involving multiple stakeholders across a very wide spectrum. SDG is also for all countries. Unlike MDG, mainly is focused on developing countries. So SDG is really for including both developed and developing countries. And I think the goal is leaving no one behind. SDG also put much more emphasis on environment. I think when you compare from MDG, there's one goal with 4 targets. But now it's 5 goals, 31 targets in SDG. So there's a much more focus on the environmental areas. And also SDG focuses much more on the tools for implementation, such as global partnerships, sustainable financing, and policy coordination, and so on. And also, I think SDG's policy process and implementation is also a much more inclusive process, as I mentioned before. So in a way, I think from a policy perspective, I think the future generation will recognize that it is the SDG is probably the greatest public policy experiment of our time. So in a way, I think we are all exhilarated by the passing of the SDG at UN. At the same time, I think now the real challenge begins. How to implement SDG in the global world. I think when we analyze, the challenges are just daunting. And we have, 15 years before we can really say that indeed, I think the passing of the SDG and the implementation of SDG is a great endeavor that we've achieved. So I think as a policy analyst, in the last 30 years and so on, I have been involved in various parts of the work related to SDG, including innovation studies, crisis management, disaster prevention, and also clean technologies and so on. So I sort of outlined some of the major challenges that we are facing in implementing SDG. The first of all, I think it's the goals are ambitious and complex. So I use 3 words to characterize that. One is complexity, the other is diversity, and the third is connectivity. I think we all agree that in fact the complexity is a key feature of SDGs. The substantive issues involved are very complex. For example, the climate change, there are still people who do not necessarily agree with the climate change. And also, we all recognize that 17 goals are just, from a policy perspective, it's just too many. It's daunting in terms of policy implementation. The second is diversity. I think we, in 193 countries all adopted this, but many of them have very different, different development stages. The priorities of different countries are also quite different. So it's unlikely that every country can move on the same pace, adopting the same priorities. So in a way, I think that in the climate change, we have this so-called common but differentiated responsibilities. But here maybe we have a common but differentiated priorities. That's probably the case that when we think about implementation. And the third is connectivities. I think if you look at the different goals, there are co-benefits of many of these goals, but we were advancing one another that will benefit the other. But at the same time, there are also contradictions among different goals. So in other words, there might be trade-offs that one has to make among these goals. And also, there are many coordinations among different parts of the societies that actually some may gain and some may lose. And also, there are international spillover effects that so one country's activity may have impact on others. So, for example, development assistance, greenhouse emissions are all examples of this spillover effects. So, in a way, I think that in terms of policy implementation, the goals are just too ambitious and too complex. At the same time, that the capacity for implementation is also limited, particularly after the 2008 financial crisis. So I think many of these great goals, if we want to achieve them, we need a lot of financing. But we know that development assistance has been in decline, particularly in debt countries. Green financing is also facing many challenges. So I think the money, how can we raise the money to support many of the initiatives that's needed for implementing SDG. The other thing is also for government capacity. Many of these initiatives would have to be indeed initiated by the government. Of course, I think that business and society, of course, have to be key partners. But the government capacity is also quite crucial. So we need the leadership. We need the analytical capabilities. And just to say the least, that the data collection is a huge nightmare. So how do you have that capacity to implement the SDG? And the third is policy coordination within and across national borders. Of course, here I think that, particularly in some big countries, coordination among different regions are just tremendous. In China, a colleague of mine, Professor Hu Wangang, is saying that in China, it's one country with 4 different worlds, different parts of the, China, they are at very different development stages. So how do you coordinate those different regions? I think they're a challenge. Also, I coordinate coordination among different countries for cross-boundary issues. So here, for example, some river basin that you have many different countries sharing the same river. You have some ecosystem that's also shared by many different countries. So how do you coordinate the activities by different countries? Of course, there are many other challenges that we need a coordination at the global level, such as a climate change issue. So all of those coordination, again, is a daunting challenge for policymakers. And the third is the policy environment is uncertain. How to communicate the SDGs to the public? Because I think, of course, individually, I think many of these goals we've talked, in the media, and we've had discussions with the public. But now we have to bring this in its totality, not individually. So here again, I think I think for many of the experts, again, we're having, so the challenge in try to, grapple to get a whole picture of it. But how do you communicate that with the general public? And also how to mobilize the general public to make them to support and to be part of it. So how do you link between the SDGs with individual behavior, with their daily behaviors? So that again, I think it's a challenge for us. And also how to persuade people to make current investment for the future gains, or to make individual sacrifices for the greater goods. So I think those are the typical issues that when we think about policy issues, I think are the very difficult challenge that we have to think about. But here is at a massive scale. And finally, but not the measurement for improvement, for performance, also is quite incomplete. We know now it's we have 17 goals with 169 targets, and also after the working group after their long efforts, they came up with 231 indicators. But of course, I think that despite we have all of this, but the really of sort of try to use these measures, use these sort of goals and targets and indicators, we find this really a daunting challenge. I think now people, the working group have said, in terms of methodology and data availability, they should divide them into 3 groups. Tier 1 is that indeed the method is clear, data is available. That's for Tier 1. And Tier 3 is no proper methods or no data available. And Tier 2 is missing one of the two. The SDSN I was involved in, I think SDSN is now is having the initial efforts of trying to roll out an index and dashboard. Really, I think they would, there's a team that's trying to collect data and making an initial ranking of the countries. I was initially actually asked them whether I'm able to present it here as the initial results. But again, there was still double checking and other things. So unfortunately, it's going to be a few days later. But I'm sure that once it's released, you'll get a chance to review it. But I think in this effort, they found that many proposed official SDG indicators lack data for the majority of the countries. Actually, not just for a few, but for majority of the countries. So in terms of the real measurement to get the feedback and to see how we can improve it, unfortunately, the data often is not available. I think the other issue, we also have to be mindful that in public policy analysis, we often caution people not to make this sort of, to avoid the issue of, the dominance of quantitative goals. We know the 17 goals, some of them are quantitative and some of them are qualitative. The qualitative goals are as important as quantitative ones. But often in the policy analysis, when we have data, and then more of the quantitative ones takes the precedent and becomes more important. So we have to avoid that. So that's also the kind of issue that we have to be mindful. So here again, I'm sort of just listing a few major challenges that what I see that we have to be prepared to address them. The ambitious and complex goals, the limited capacity, the uncertain policy environment, and the incomplete measurement. So those are the things that, as an academic society, I think we have a lot to contribute to address them. Now let me shift the gear to looking at implementing SDG from the traditional China. I think in a way China is somewhere in between. I think it's a developing country, but again, have moved fast in the last 30 plus years, and now sort of facing some of the traditional developing countries' challenge, but at the same time also are facing many of the problems that, sharing some of the problems that developing countries are facing. So I will talk a little bit about the issues that China has been doing and also what are the key challenges China is going through. First of all, I think what has happened over the last 30 plus years in China. So I summarize that into 4 major transformations in China. The first one is the economic system. As we can see that the Chinese economy has shifted from a planned economy to a market-based economy. And the outcome of that is a rapid economic growth. The second major transition is industrial structure change. As we can see that at the beginning of the reform, agriculture takes about 30% of China's GDP. Now it's only about 9%. Service in the 1980s was about 20%, and now it's over 50% in the first time in China's history. And of course, manufacturing remained to be quite high and started to, in 1980, about half of China's GDP. Now it's just a bit over 40%. So there's underlying the transition of the growth of the economy, there's also a fundamental change in Chinese economic structure. And of course, underlying that is the labor change. As you can see that in the 1981, and over 2/3 of China's labor is in agriculture. Now it's only about a bit over 1/3. The service has picked up quite substantially. And the third change is a societal change. Before China's reform, China is a very closed and rural society. About 80% of the population lives in rural areas. But now, as you can see, the change since the reform, and now more than half of the population live in urban areas. And now every year, about 1% of the population move to the urban. Of course, the single 1%, that's not a big number. But in China, 1% means about 14 million people moving to the city. So again, the challenge to I think we have one goal. We talk about the sustainable cities. I think the challenge to the urban areas is huge. And also in terms of from a closed society to an open society, of course, before the reform, the China is very much to the so-called self-reliance, and now China has become a largest trading partner in the world. In the past, China has been working hard to attract FDI, and now actually China is also an active investor outside China. I think last year is a year that when actually outward investment is surpassed inward investment. And also, of course, in terms of internet access and in terms of overseas travel, it's a lot. I think, in the year 2000, there are over 10 million people traveling overseas, and 2 years ago it's 115 million traveling. And I'm sure now in some of the Lisbon tourist sites you see many Chinese tourists there. And last one is governance. The governance system has also changed fundamentally. I think before the reform, I think the governance system is really relied on the personal charisma and the centralization of the authority. Now it's increasingly become one that's focused on efficiency and participation. So there's a lot of government effort in trying to reform the governance system, try to expand public service, and also the anti-corruption campaign also has been quite working hard. And also civil society and grassroots democracy has also been growing. China started the village election in the early 1990s and has been going on ever since. NGO development has also been becoming a major effort in recent years. And also in the policy process, there are increasingly more mechanisms for the public to get involved. All of that, I think, is wonderful and has really changed China, for over the last 30 plus years. But at the same time, now we can see that China is entering a new phase. In China, we call this new normal. The new challenges, I think, again, we can summarize them into some major major issues. The first one, the first thing is the limitation of the development model China has followed over the last 30 plus years. I think in a way, the economic growth in the last 30 years are based on people's hard work and also on the scale expansion. But that system, that model is running out of steam. And also, I think there was a really very strong government intervention trying to steer the direction of the economic growth. But now I think that intervention leads to many market distortions that needs to be corrected. So I think actually in the most recent, a major policy document by the government is basically saying, let the market to play the decisive role in allocating resources. The second key issue is the social change. I think increasingly we see there's very diverse interests and very different values are growing, as the Chinese economy grows. So the fragmentation of social values have also become a major challenge. So how do you really bring that cohesion of the society is also a key challenge for the country. And the third one is also in terms of in the international community, how to maintain, how to first of all to be integrated into the global economic system and into the global governance system, but at the same time also to maintain indigenous capabilities in terms of innovation, in terms of production capabilities, and how do you balance those two are still, I think, a challenge that the country is grappling with. The last one is very close, a link to this, this group, is the resource and environmental constraints. So while China has enjoyed huge economic growth, but also has suffered tremendously in terms of its environment. And so there are actually many of the data that I'll just show you the kind of the scales that we're talking about. First of all, in terms of energy production and consumption, as you can see that over the last 30 plus China's the white bar is the consumption, the red bar is production. As you can see that increasingly now China has to rely on the energy imports for its growth. And here also is China's energy structure. So while China has a huge need for energy, but as you can see that the very high percentage is somewhere around 60 to 70% is coal. So China is coal rich, but I think we all understand now. The burning of the coal is a huge, I think, problem for greenhouse emission. And so I think how do you maintain the economic growth, but also I think at the same time raise the energy efficiency and also reduce the reliance on coal. I think again that's a huge challenge for China. And the third is also private car ownership. As you can see, cumulatively the cars has been the ownership, private car ownership has been grown rapidly. And so you see that while China has been making a lot of efforts trying to contain this growth, but still I think the emission from the automobiles have generated huge smogs. For those of you who have been to Beijing, you see from time to time that smog is quite heavy. And of course, related to all this, the coal, SO2, smoke, dust emissions are all sort of growing. And of course, the CO2 emission, this white bar is China, and the red bar is the US. So before 2006, 2007, we can say US still is the largest emitter. Now there's no doubt that China has become the largest largest CO2 emission emitter. So all of those are the huge challenges that China has to address. I think actually before the SDG was formally adopted, China has already began to shift gears and trying to make the change. But again, I think this is like a huge machine. It's not easy to make the change. So I think that, I will now give you some examples of the things that China has already done before the SDG was formally adopted. First of all, I think the mindset change in leadership. I think the first stage of China's development in 1970 to early 2000, I think they try to catch up in economic development is the key policy goals. So we're talking about doubling the Chinese economy, doubling the GDP in 10 years, in 20 years, and so on. So that has been the chief goals of the government. But actually, already in 2003, there were already a change of mindset, recognize the issues that we've just talked about. So in 2003, actually, there was a new idea being proposed, so-called the scientific development, trying to shift the focus from just on the speed of development to a more coordinated development addressing environmental problems and so on. But unfortunately, I think the policy communication is not as effective as it could have been. So in fact, the real change is still slow. So now most recently, I think in 2015, last year, in the process of developing the 13th five-year plan, China proposed so-called 5 new development principles, and the focus on innovation-driven development, coordinated development, green development, open development, and inclusive or sharing development. So those 5 major sort of ideas becomes the guiding principles of China's future development. So that has, I think, sort of finally come into a much more coherent ways, and also it's quite in sync with the SDGs. So I think the mindset has finally, I think, has made that a great change. The second example I wanted to talk about is the national strategic planning. To a certain degree, we can think about SDG as a strategic planning exercise for the human society, except that our cycle is 15 years, right? But of course, people say, we are not a planned economy. What's the use of this 5-year plan? And what I see this plan, indeed, is no longer the plan 20 years or 30 years ago. It is more of a visionary document based on a very elaborated process to illustrate the strategic direction of the nation, and also to clarify major economic and social development goals, major tasks and initiatives, and also provide directions and guidance for business and the government. So I think that as a large country, I think such an exercise, at least from a policy perspective, I think it's very useful. So I think that, in fact, it's really a national, it's more of a planning system where national has the guidelines, but also there are sectoral plans and also provincial and municipal plans to see how they can actually align their goals with the overall guidance of the national plan. And also, such an exercise, the outcome is important, but often the process is as important. So almost before the 2 years of the final release of the document, of the plan, the prior background studies were conducted, and our school, we were also involved. So there were some of the commission studies, and also there were open bid on major issues listed by the National Development and Reform Commission. That's really outlining the issues that need to be studied. And also there are many government agencies who are also involved in doing this background review and background studies. And also the drafting process of the planning is also led by the top leadership. So there was the Xi Jinping, the President Xi Jinping, and many of his colleagues are also heavily involved in this process, trying to disseminate the information, gather the feedbacks from the general public, from various stakeholders, and to see how that can be brought into the national strategic plan. And finally, I think the document that was adopted by the People's Congress in March 2016, and that has become the guiding principles for the next 5 years development. Of course, I think the academia and the research community has played a key role in various stages of this exercise. So these two examples are more at the very national level and the very strategic level. And also China has also done a lot in the past 10, 15 years on innovation for green transformation. And my colleague and I, we've done some studies on how low carbon technologies has been developed and deployed in China. And this is an example. You see that this is the global. This is I think it's this is the solar, and this is a global installation, and this is China's installation. So China actually is a major player in this field. And so my colleagues and I, we've done some studies, and which actually will be published in a special issue of Science and Public Policy later this year. And so we looked at the 4 sets of issues that are playing a role in low-carbon technology development in China. The first one is knowledge, that's generally prior. It's more of a sort of public-funded research that provided the important knowledge base, and also provided learning capabilities for many of the institutions involved. So that knowledge base is very important. Secondly, it's more of industrial capabilities, because over the last 30 plus years, Chinese industries have played a very important role in terms of manufacturing many goods in China. So they've accumulated a lot of the skills through OEM production and so on. So that capability, manufacturing capabilities, also become important. And the third, of course, is the market. Initially, the domestic market actually is quite fragmented, and it's very difficult to implement and to install those solar technologies. But at the same time, because of China's entry to WTO, international market became accessible. So many of those industries have to first try to install that in the international market. Later, I think when the domestic market becomes more mature, and they began to get into the domestic market. And here I think the policy has played a crucial role in terms of, for example, in fostering the market domestically, and also to promote innovation. And so that role is important. But also we can see that when sometimes you can see some distortions because of the local government policies, heavy-handed policies. For example, financing, providing a lot of financing for PV expansion of the scale, but it turned out when the international market changed, when domestic market changed, that expansion was totally wasted. So I think that there are many lessons to be learned from there. And the other thing I think also be interesting is to look at now we are in a globalized world, and so the confluence of the sectors are really shaping the evolution of this technology in China, but also has a huge global implications. So one example is the case of U.S. and China's PV industry. Several years ago, I was involved in the U.S.-China Innovation Dialogue, and this is one example we looked at. And U.S. and China's it turned out in this PV industry are quite closely linked. So in 2010, the trade between the two countries, China to the U.S. is 1,441 million, and U.S. to China is somewhere between 1,600 to 1,900 million. And here I think it's interesting that U.S. It produces really producing a lot of polysilicons and equipment. They export it to China, and then China, of course, produces cells and export it to U.S. solar system, which actually installed many of those solar system. And so in a way, this becomes sort of a global production chain. So when there was, trade disputes between U.S. and China, it turned out that it hurts both China and the U.S. So I think in the globalized world and many of this industrial development, I think it's difficult to use more of the national interest to settle. So that's more of an industry-based example. Now let me give you another example of more of again, targeted efforts of in China to try to address some of the key issues that's in the SDG, the war on poverty. So in 2015, China began its war on poverty, and the basic idea is try to really to eradicate extreme poverty by the year 2020. So there were many efforts in doing so. Actually, our school is also, some of the faculties are involved. And here is, if you look at it in general, I think the poverty reduction over the last 30 plus years, China has done a great job, and this, of course, is depending on where you put the bar of the poverty line. And if the lower line, you can see that there's a tremendous reduction. And the higher line, I think this is in the year 2000. I think a higher line was put, and then you can see that indeed the more poor people. And in the year 2010, another even higher, the poverty line was raised, and then you get higher percentage of people. But roughly about 70 million people are still living in poverty. And some of our colleagues have done some work in trying to analyzing what are the major causes of poverty. And here, some people, because of they are sick, they do not have the money to start their business. They do not have the technology. Some of the handicapped. The education is not adequate. Lack of land and disasters. So there are many different reasons why people get poor. So that's the academia has done some analysis on what are the major causes. And so now China has done try to develop some major approaches in addressing this, very targeted. One is try to develop the industry and to help to get about 30 million out of the poor, and also to try to relocate people, because there are some geographically the natural conditions are so difficult. It's very hard to get people to live in there, so to move them out. And the third also is to provide people with support to preserve the ecological environment. And the fourth is to improve the education and training, and finally to provide social protections for the people who are really not able to, who are handicapped and so on, who are not able to support themselves. So all of this, I think, is really more of a targeted effort trying to address the poverty problem, and also to find out, where in different regions, what are the specific problems, and to see how that can be addressed. Of course, I think implementing this particular poverty alleviations are many difficulties and challenges. Again, I will not elaborate on that. And finally, let me use one example to see how our academia can be of help. We have recently started a China Energy Modeling Forum in our school, trying to provide an analytical support for better policy. And here the mission is to support rational decision-making in China by facilitating discussion and improving the use of energy and environmental economic models, and also try to provide an interactive platform for China's national energy and environmental modeling and policy analysis teams following those principles. But we have we have some quite capable of modeling teams. But unfortunately, their models are built on different assumptions, using different parameters and so on. So often, when they present the outcome to the policymakers are somewhat baffled, because the recommendations are quite different. So in a way, we wanted to provide a neutral platform for people to come together, to exchange ideas, to see why your assumption is such that, different from others. So that's sort of the goals that we try to achieve. So here are some of the different models that we have to, we are trying to bring people together, because many of these models are interlinked together. And also we've got many of the, so we serve as the service provider, as the team, but also we bring many partners from research teams, and also we received some support from the Environmental Defense Fund from the US and some other partners. So I think that's sort of so we've already had some meetings and conferences and so on. So we hope that through this effort we can help the policymaker to have a better understanding of the limitations, the strengths and limitations of different models. So we have a 5-year plan in terms of each year we are focusing on one particular types of models. And overall, what we hope we can achieve is harmonized assumptions for different models, and also generate various policy scenarios, because I think often that's sort of the, when we think about policy, particularly the sort of long-term policy, that's sort of the tools that we need to use. And also the various indicators to compare. And hopefully that will improve overall the modeling quality. Okay, now let me shift to of course, these are all the effort that has been done in the past, but now I think after the SDGs adoption, I think China has a lot of efforts trying to support the SDG. China is committed to implement SDG, and it's now great efforts now being trying to publicize the agenda. And recently, in June, UNDP has provided an analysis comparing SDGs and China's 15th five-year plan. There's a great similarities in terms of the coordination among the two. I only took part of that as one example. You see the goal 2, 3, 5, and 6 in accordance with the various chapters in the 13th five-year plan. And also China wants to start a coordination mechanism for implementing SDG, including 43 government agencies. And also the war on poverty I mentioned that will hopefully get an early harvest for the implementation of the 2030 agenda. Also now China is drafting a national plan for implementing the 2030 the SDG. And also, there are many, I think, mechanisms at the UN level. China is actively participating. In fact, I think 2 days ago, there was a high-level discussion at the UN on this. And also, China wants to use its presidency at G20 as this year to try to bring, the SDG agenda to a higher attention to this group. So China is promoting to get the inclusive and interconnected development as one of the key policy agenda item in this year's G20. And also to urge G20 members to draft a collective action plan on the SDG. And also to propose a new G20 agenda issue called Industrialization of Africa. And and also there are some other issues related to less developed countries. And also China also try to convene various dialogues within non-G20 countries. Of course, I think that I've outlined all these efforts and so on, but there are also tremendous challenges in China in implementing SDGs. And in fact, last year I co-chaired a project on China's governing capacity challenges for green transformation. So here I'm sort of more of a based on the outcomes of that study, and I think many of them are actually also applicable to the SDG the discussion. The first one is government's capabilities in making decisions based on sound scientific principles and broad public participation. I think for many of the developing countries, I think this is a key challenge. In China, I think maybe central government is better, but for many local governments, it's a huge challenge. So how do you really make the local plans, the local development issues to make that really based on scientific principles, not really wasting a lot of money? And of course, here the professional knowledge and the quality information are the key. The second is executive branch of the government to implement policy. Again, here there's a lot of issues. I won't belabor you on that, but I think there's quite a problem in terms of how do you match the responsibilities and with the enough resources, and also in terms of how to provide the better coordinations among various government agencies. Also, the capacity of the market to incentivize innovation and to internalize environmental externalities. Again, in developing countries, I think this is also a huge challenge. I think that, and also the how to really get the social, the civil society to play its role. I think in many cases that we do not have enough sort of institutional support to really making sure that they are part of the discussion. And also, I think many of the NGOs, they also have a problem of lack of knowledge and lack of resources to play their role. So how do you strengthen them? That's also a huge challenge. So I think based on that analysis, our group last year, we sort of provided some key policy recommendations. Basically, we wanted to, some of the key principles is, how do you combine the political will with sound analysis? How do you really, sort of have the consistent top-level design with diversified local plans, and also how do you provide a clear direction of the policy, and while you also have flexible implementation measures. So some of our key policy recommendations include, the first one is let science lead. Basically, all the policy, all the implementation plans need to be analyzed carefully, needs to be based on sound scientific principles. Secondly, so empower the public. And how do you, here I think it's not just by promoting a general promotion, but rather to really provide the institutional legitimacy and the rights for the for the NGOs to be part of the discussion. And the third is incentivize business. And here, indeed, we need to use policy and the legal tools to really incentivize business to be an active partner, but rather than a passive partner in the process. And also reform the government. I think now increasingly we see that there's a lack of trust in the government global-wide. And I think as someone who has studied government for my whole sort of academic life, I see government still has to play a key role in this process in promoting sustainable development. So we need to reshape the government to make sure that it's really changing along with the technology and with the environment. Okay, finally, let me conclude that SDG implementation is a very knowledge-intensive policy experiment. It requires active involvement of academia, community in helping government, business, and society in designing sound policies, finding right policy tools, and making rational trade-offs. So getting involved is not only a golden opportunity for all of us, but also, I think, our responsibility. SDG implementation is also an interdisciplinary and also international. It requires joint work of people with different disciplinary background, and also requires the sharing of knowledge and experience across national boundaries. So ISDRS is a great platform, as already the President has mentioned, to promote such dialogue and joint work. So congratulations for the great work you've already done, and I look forward to working with you in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Lenschi, for your excellent keynote. Now we have some time for discussion, for questions, so I will, just over there, first one.
Small paper.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you very much. I hear your call for empowering the public, and in particular NGOs. How do you balance that against the Chinese government's recent attacks on NGOs and changing the law to actually decrease the amount of power that NGOs, and even threatening international NGOs that if they criticize the government, they're going to get closed down?
I will receive, I think, 2 more questions and then answers from Professor Lenschi over there.
Professor, could you comment on the ecological civilization policy? What you didn't mention it at all in your talk.
Over there.
My name is Volker Mofer, University of Vienna. Thank you for your excellent overview on SDGs and their implementation, especially in China. You mentioned rational trade-offs, and you mentioned there are quite many SDGs with quite many targets. And I wonder if you could give us an idea about this, like you called it, common but differentiated priorities, and how to make the trade-offs. What would be guidelines, what would be criteria for those trade-offs in different regions, for example? Thank you.
Professor Lan Shui, maybe you can answer these three first questions and then we can proceed.
Okay, let me try to address these issues. I think these are all wonderful questions. I think first of all on the international NGO laws. Indeed, I think China passed an international NGO laws probably a few months ago. I think there's a lot of discussion, a lot of controversies on that. We have in our school, we have an NGO institute, and they've done a lot of study on this. I think first of all, I think that if you look at before the passing of the law, there was no NGO law in China. So many of the NGOs, international NGOs, are really operating on a very gray zone. Gray zone means that they do not have, many of the international NGOs, they are really, so in terms of their registration, they do not have a proper way to register, to get registered. Some of them registered as a business unit, but many others are just really operating as a social organization, but without proper legal status. In fact, our school, we have a joint research institute with the Brookings Institution. We have the Tsinghua Brookings Public Policy Center. So this was 10 years ago when we were starting to try to do something like this. And again, so we were thinking about maybe we wanted to register as a separate NGO, international NGO, but found it difficult. There's no legal basis for it. So I think from that point of view, I think passing of the international NGO law, I think it's a progress, so that actually there's a proper legal framework for international NGOs in operating in China. Of course, I think that a lot of people are concerned because I think the agency that's really been in charge on this is so-called the Ministry of Public Security, and so a lot of people are having problems. And in fact, our NGO Research Institute have also submitted their suggestions on how actually that can be improved and so on. But of course, I think there are many concerns from the government point of view, and also because I think in China, because the Public Security Ministry is the one that already has that infrastructure in terms of registering, and for foreign nationals when they enter China, they have registration all based on the Public Security Ministry. So there's a lot of internal in terms of governing, in terms of administrative capacities, as well as also China's concern of social stabilities. Indeed, I think there were many stories about various kind of NGOs playing the roles in terms of instigating social unrest and so on. So out of all those concerns, I think there was the decision was made along this way. I think in general, so far, I think that probably there are if not a million, probably close to a million of international NGOs. I think probably 90% or 95% of them are all just operating the way they have been doing. I think that they're following the procedures, doing that. So I think, of course, hopefully this will be operated for a few years, and then we'll see what its negatives and positives, and then how that can be revised. But I think with this legal framework, I think it's probably better than none. The second, on the ecological civilization, indeed, I didn't mention that because I didn't think I have the time to really explain clearly what is ecological civilization. But I think this indeed, I think it shows the Chinese leadership, particularly I think and also the Chinese society of really recognizing that the environmental problems of sustainable development is not just more of a development issue. It's a whole. How do you reconcile with the with sort of natural environment, with the sort of the traditional? So in a way, I think there's a recognition of the traditional Chinese culture part, where I think there's a harmony between man and nature. But of course, I think that's a very abstract, sort of terms, and you do have to, bring down to various policy aspects. So I'm more of a sort of, focus on that instead of really explaining that to many of the audience who may not be very familiar with it. And the third issue is on the third issue. I think on the common. What is third?
Rational trade-offs.
Oh, rational trade-offs.
Benchmarks and criteria for that.
Yeah. I think that indeed. I think that of course, many of those trade-offs, it be very difficult to make it from top down. I think that I recognize this challenge. I think many years ago when I was involved in a very local community. I think when they really wanted to build a sort of like a reservoir, they sort of like a hydro power station. But exactly at that community, there was a very ancient site of the historical site of many thousands. It goes back to thousands of years ago of that site where I think there was also a historical hydraulic sort of effort. And so I think many of the international society and many of the national press and so on, they all said we need to protect this site. We should not build this hydraulic project. But when I actually went there, so we were actually of the same view. So we try to, in a way, so we feel that we should educate the people to say how important this is to the national heritage and so on. But when we talked with the local people, and the local people have their concerns, they said, yes, indeed, you are great. You said this need to be protected. But how about our lives? We want to improve our lives. And there's this huge potential for power, and we were not able to benefit from it. You said it's so wonderful to protect this, but please, you then should provide with a compensation. That's more than enough. I mean, that should be enough for us to also have a good life as you guys did. So in a way, I think that that sort of reminded us that there are many of the things that we felt was, sort of very, from top down, we think that's sort of the rational principle that we should follow, but then if you look at it from bottom up, I think our things are different. So I think that we need to, first of all, to understand what are the challenges people are making, but also we need to think about how when people are making the trade-offs, how they can condition the contextualizing with what their local conditions. So I think that's what I meant in terms of sort of common but differentiated priorities, common goals but differentiated priorities.
We still have time for 2 quick questions before the coffee break, so please. Yo. And then.
Thank you very much for your very interesting presentation. I have a question in relation to your last policy recommendations. You said, let science lead. So my question is related to how can you balance this faith in science with traditional and local knowledges?
Yeah, here, in the front, last one.
Thank you very much for a great presentation. In fact, I observed that you had made all the recommendations to accomplish SDG goals, what the government need to do, the reforms in the government, the training of the public servants, so on and so forth. what are the policy framework that is being made for the corporates there within China? Because government alone, the various agencies of government or municipality or district, they alone cannot really achieve all SDG goals. The corporates need to contribute in that. So what policy framework is being made for them?
Okay, I think the first one is on the in terms of science and how to reconcile science and with local knowledge. I think that when we say science, we're not talking about just talking about sort of quantum physics. So I think science also, I think local knowledge is also part of the science that we have to be to include. Particularly, I think on many of the sort of implementation of SDGs, we need to have the natural knowledge from natural science, from engineering, but also from behavioral science. I think that there are many, policy designs that ignored behavioral science, and it turned out that many of those policies, would run into a failure. So I think when we say, science, that means indeed we include also knowledge, so local knowledge. We include also knowledge from, from economic, from social, and political research. So I think that's sort of, so I don't see a contradiction. And also in terms of, I think this question, of course, is it's a really wonderful one that in China, the multi-layered government, in terms of policy framework, I think how do you, reconcile in terms of central, local, and the municipal. I think that in China is also now undergoing through some major changes in many of the SDG-related areas. One example is on the environmental protection. Environmental protection, that responsibility usually is it's with the local municipal government, so they have to be responsible. But of course, we know that will generate a lot of the problems. So the local government put a lot of emphasis on the economic production. So now I think there's this, that responsibility has been centralized at the provincial level. So provincial level government has the responsibility of really looking at the environmental protection. And so that sort of vertical integration of the regulatory responsibilities is one example of that change. But of course, I think there are many other goals that some has to be coordinated at the national, others also have to be done at the municipal. So it's an ongoing, ongoing process of reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your questions and for your answers. Before closing this section, I would like to say that we can proceed with this discussion during the coffee break, since we don't have more time for more questions during this period. But before closing the section, I would like to thank once again Professor Lan Shui for being here with us and sharing your knowledge and your key speech with us. It was a great pleasure, and I would like to ask Antia to give a small gift from Portugal to Professor Lan Shui. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your interesting talk. And this is a gift from Portugal, and to take some beautiful things from this country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now the first plenary is closed. We can go to the coffee break. Thanks once again.